She stood in the rain outside Gangnam Severance Hospital with her mother's test results clutched so tightly the paper had gone soft. She didn't see the taxi until its horn cut through the downpour and its bumper stopped 6 inches from her knees. "Are you trying to die?" the driver shouted through the cracked window. Adise Chukwu, 26, soaked, 3 months behind on rent she couldn't tell her mother about, stared back at him with nothing left to lose. "Maybe," she answered in Korean good enough to surprise him. "Would that solve anything?" He looked at her too long, too still, then leaned over and shoved the passenger door open. "Get in before you catch pneumonia and I have to explain why a foreigner died in front of my cab." That was how it started. Not at a gala. Not with a mistaken identity. Just a near collision on a wet street in Seoul and a taxi driver named Han Ji-hoon who kept glancing at her in the rearview like he was trying to solve something. She gave him the address of the tiny office tel she shared with 2 other foreign workers. She didn't tell him the paper in her lap said her mother's cancer had spread, or that the treatment back home in Enugu cost more than she made in 8 months. She didn't tell him anything. But he watched her hands shake the whole ride. When they reached her building, he didn't ask for the fare. "Next time," he said, "look both ways. Not everyone in this city will stop." There was something underneath the sentence. She felt it before she understood it. She didn't know he hadn't driven a real taxi in 4 years. She didn't know the name on every boardroom door in the country wasn't the one he was using tonight. She only knew he had kind, tired eyes and that when their fingers brushed as he handed back her forgotten umbrella, something she'd sealed shut a long time ago cracked open half an inch. If you're watching from the beginning, drop a comment and tell us where in the world you are tonight. And if stories like this pull you in, hit subscribe and like before the next scene. What Adise is about to discover will change everything she thinks she understands about the man in that taxi. He came back for her 3 nights later. Not by accident. She was standing outside the same hospital, this time holding a bag of her mother's medication that had cost her the last of her savings, when the same battered gray Sonata rolled up to the curb like it had been circling the block, waiting. "You again," she said, half-guarded, half relieved in a way that unsettled her. "Get in," he said. "It's raining." "It's not raining." "It will be." And it did 20 minutes later, as if the city itself had decided to prove him right, and she sat in the back seat watching the wipers beat time against the windshield while he asked her, carefully, like each question cost him something, why a woman with a translator's vocabulary and a doctor's fluency in medical terminology was riding in the back of cabs instead of working behind a desk somewhere important. She told him half the truth. That her visa was tied to a company that barely paid her. That her mother was sick. That she sent home more than she kept for herself and prayed every month the math would somehow work out. She didn't ask him a single question about his own life, because she assumed she already knew the answer: a tired man working nights to make ends meet, same as her, same as everyone crowded onto the last subway car at midnight. It didn't occur to her to wonder why his hands, gripping the wheel, were too smooth for a man who supposedly worked 12-hour shifts. It didn't occur to her that the watch on his wrist, half hidden beneath his sleeve, was worth more than the car he was driving. It didn't occur to her because he made sure of it. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, sitting in the back of that cab with her mother's medicine in her lap, and her heart doing something dangerous and unfamiliar, was that 3 floors above the hospital where he'd first found her, a private wing existed that few people in Korea even knew was named after his family. And that the man steering her safely home through the storm, night after night, was the same man 3 tabloids had spent 2 years trying and failing to photograph. He wasn't hiding from the rain. He was hiding from himself. 3 weeks passed, and the taxi kept finding her. Adise told herself it was coincidence the first 4 times. By the 5th she stopped pretending. Every other night, somewhere between the hospital and the pharmacy and the tiny apartment where her roommates had started teasing her about her regular driver, the gray Sonata would appear at the curb like it had been summoned. "You could just give me your number," she said one night, sliding into the back seat with a particular exhaustion of someone who'd spent the day fighting with an insurance office in 2 languages. "Save the gas money circling my neighborhood." "I don't circle," Ji-hoon said too quickly, and she caught the corner of his mouth twitch, the closest thing to a smile she'd seen from him. "I have a route." A route that happens to pass a hospital, my apartment, and the pharmacy on Yoksamaro, all in one night, 3 times a week. Seoul traffic is unpredictable. Seoul traffic, she said, is the most predictable thing in this entire city, and you know it. He didn't answer that. He just reached over without asking and turned the heater up 2 degrees, because he'd noticed the way he noticed things he never mentioned out loud, that she'd been rubbing her hands together since she got in. It was a small thing. It shouldn't have mattered. But Adiz had spent 6 years in Korea being invisible to landlords who overcharged foreigners, to employers who paid her less because they knew she couldn't afford to argue, to a city that swallowed 9 million people and rarely looked any of them in the eye. And here was a man who noticed her cold hands. She was in more trouble than she wanted to admit. The trouble had a shape she couldn't yet name, and it started the night she asked him, half joking, what a taxi driver did with his days when he wasn't ferrying stubborn foreign women through the rain. Something shifted behind his eyes. A door closing fast, before she could see what was on the other side of it. Nothing interesting, he said. You're lying. I'm driving. Pay attention to the road, not to me. I'm in the back seat. You're the one who's supposed to be watching the road. He laughed, then really laughed. A short, surprised sound like it had escaped before he could stop it, and for a moment he looked 10 years younger, like whatever weight usually sat on his shoulders had briefly forgotten to hold on. She wanted to ask more. She didn't, because some instinct older than curiosity told her that if she pushed, he'd disappear. And some nights, his was the only face and soul that looked at her like she was a person and not a problem to be managed. What she didn't see was the black sedan that trailed them at a careful distance for 4 blocks before peeling off, the same sedan that had been parked outside Han Ji-hoon's actual residence for 6 days, ever since his head of security, a sharp-eyed man named Oh Sung-min, had started asking why the young chairman's location logs showed 3-hour gaps every Tuesday and Thursday night. Sung-min hadn't told the board yet. He hadn't told Ji-hoon's grandfather, the founder, whose empire Hanwuri Group, 17 subsidiaries deep in shipping, construction, and biotech, did not tolerate its heir behaving like an ordinary man for even a single evening. But Sung-min had a photograph now, grainy, taken through a rain-streaked windshield. His employer in a cheap jacket, holding an umbrella over a woman he'd never been introduced to. That photograph would matter later. Neither Adiz nor Ji-hoon knew it existed yet. What Adiz knew that night was that her mother's 2nd round of treatment had been approved, and that the deposit required by the private clinic in Enugu was due in 11 days, an amount that made her stomach drop every time she did the math. She hadn't planned to tell him. It slipped out somewhere between the pharmacy and her apartment, exhaustion loosening her grip on the careful wall she kept between her real life and the 30-minute pocket of peace she found in the back of his taxi. 11 days, she said, staring at her hands. I don't know what I'm going to do. Ji-hoon didn't say anything for a long moment. The wipers ticked. A red light held them at the intersection near her building, rain smearing the glow of a convenience store sign into a soft blur. How much, he finally said, do you need? Don't. Her voice sharpened, pride flaring hot and fast. I'm not telling you so I don't need charity from a taxi driver who's probably struggling himself. Something crossed his face that she couldn't read. Guilt maybe. Or something closer to grief. Adiz. It was the first time he'd said her name like that, slowly, like he was memorizing it, like he already knew he was going to disappoint her. There's something I should have told you 3 weeks ago. Her chest tightened. What? The light turned green. He didn't move the car. I'm not who you think I am. The words hung in the air between them, and for one suspended second Adiz thought he might actually say it, whatever it was that made his jaw tighten and his hands grip the wheel like it was the only solid thing in the car. Then his phone buzzed. Once. A 3rd time, insistent, and she watched something close over his face like a shutter dropping. He glanced at the screen. Whatever he saw there drained the color from him. I have to go, he said too fast, already pulling the car forward through the green light. I'm sorry. I have to go. Ji-hoon. Take care of your mother. He said it like an apology and a goodbye stitched into one sentence, and he didn't look at her again, not even when she climbed out at her building with her heart slamming against her ribs and 11 days suddenly feeling like the least of her problems. She stood on the sidewalk and watched the taillights disappear around the corner faster than she'd ever seen him drive. He didn't come back the next night. Or the one after that. By the fourth night, Adiz told herself she'd imagined the whole thing, the near crash, the rides, the way he noticed her cold hands. She told herself a man like that, whoever he really was, had simply grown tired of playing chauffeur to a stranger's problems. She went back to taking the bus, standing shoulder to shoulder with exhausted commuters, and tried not to search every passing taxi for a face that wasn't there. She didn't know that 3 kilometers away, inside a glass tower with the Hanwuri Group's insignia carved into black marble 40 floors above the street, a very different conversation was taking place. "You've been seen." Oh Sungmin laid the photograph on the desk without ceremony, the rain-blurred image of his employer holding an umbrella over a woman neither of them had cleared. 6 weeks, 3 sightings. I've kept it off the board's radar so far. Your grandfather has not. Han Ji-hoon, Han Tae-shik on every legal document that mattered, chairman-designate of a company worth more than most nations' GDP. A name he'd spent his whole adult life trying to outrun, stood at the window with his back to the room, watching the city he'd been driving through in disguise for 6 weeks like a man allowed, briefly, to be ordinary. She doesn't know who I am. She will. Everyone finds out eventually. The question is whether she finds out from you, or from a tabloid, or from your grandfather's lawyers offering her money to disappear. Ji-hoon turned. He wouldn't. Sungmin's silence answered for him. He's done it before, Sungmin said quietly. To someone else. You were 17. You don't remember because you weren't supposed to. The words landed like a physical blow. Ji-hoon had spent 9 years believing his mother left because she chose to a story his grandfather had fed him so carefully, so completely, that it had calcified into memory. He'd never once considered that the woman who raised him for 17 years might have been paid, or threatened, or simply erased from a life she hadn't wanted to leave. If a story like this makes you feel something, the fear, the heartbreak, the sense that something bigger is always hiding beneath the surface, let us know in the comments. And tap like if you're staying until the end, because what happens next is going to break your heart before it puts it back together. He went back for her on the 5th night. Not in the Sonata. Adiz was walking home from the bus stop, exhausted, her mind on the deposit still short by an amount she didn't know how to close, when a black sedan she'd never seen before pulled alongside her, sleek and silent in a way that made her stomach drop for entirely different reasons than usual. The window lowered. It was him. Different jacket. Different car. Same tired eyes, except now they carried something heavier, guilt, maybe, or fear. Get in, he said. Please. I owe you the truth, and you deserve to hear it from me before you hear it from anyone else. She didn't move. Whose car is this? Mine. He exhaled like the word cost him something. They're all mine. The Sonata was borrowed. Everything else. The company, the building your hospital is named after in 3 years when construction finishes. The account that could clear your mother's entire treatment without me feeling it, that's mine too. The street noise seemed to fade around her. You're not a taxi driver. I haven't driven a real shift in 4 years. Then what, she said, voice shaking, have the last 6 weeks been? He looked at her the way he had that very first night in the rain, like he was seeing something he wasn't supposed to. The only honest hours I've had in a very long time. She should have walked away. Every instinct her mother raised her with told her to walk away from a rich man's games, from money that came wrapped in secrets, from a lie 6 weeks deep. But she thought of his hands on the wheel, careful and unshowy, and the way he'd turned the heater up without being asked, and the guilt written so plainly across his face now that it didn't look like the face of a man playing a game at all. It looked like the face of a man who was about to lose the only thing that had ever felt real. Get in, he said again, softer. There's more. And you're not going to like where it starts. She got in. The sedan pulled away from the curb smooth as glass, nothing like the rattling Sonata that had carried her through 6 weeks of rides she'd never admit to missing. Adiz sat with her hands folded tight in her lap, watching the city slide past through tinted windows, waiting for him to speak. My name is Han Tae-shik, he said finally. Ji-hoon is my mother's family name. I used it because no one in Seoul would think twice about a taxi driver named Han Ji-hoon. Everyone knows the name Tae-shik. Should I know it? If you've ever bought medicine at a Hanwuri pharmacy, ridden a Hanwuri-built subway line, watched the hospital tower go up 3 blocks from where I found you standing in the rain. He said it without pride, like reciting a list of debts. My grandfather founded the company 60 years ago. I'm supposed to inherit it in 8 months, on my 30th birthday, whether I want to or not. Adiz stared at him. Somewhere in the last 6 weeks she had built a version of this man in her head, tired, underpaid, carrying burdens not so different from her own, and watching that version dissolve felt like losing someone, even though he was sitting right beside her. Why, she said slowly, would a man who's about to inherit one of the largest companies in Korea spend his nights driving a stranger to the pharmacy? He was quiet long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer. Because for 3 hours twice a week, nobody needed anything from me, he said. Not the board. Not my grandfather. Not the shareholders who've started a rumor campaign because they think I'm too soft to run the company he built. For 3 hours, I was just a man driving a woman who talked back to him instead of bowing. Faint, humorless smile. You have no idea how rare that is for me. That's not an answer. That's a very good excuse. It's both. She looked away first, out the window, because something in his voice had gotten dangerously close to sincere, and sincerity from him right now felt like something she couldn't afford. You said there was more, and that I wouldn't like where it starts. His jaw tightened. Songmin, my head of security, showed me something 2 days ago. A file that's existed for 9 years and that I was never supposed to see. About what? My mother. The word came out rough, like it still didn't sit comfortably in his mouth. I grew up believing she left us. That she chose a life without me over the company, over my grandfather, over everything. It's the story he told me when I was 17, and I never once questioned it, because why would a child question the only parent he had left? And it wasn't true. There's a wire transfer in that file. 40 million won, routed through 3 shell accounts, paid out the same week she disappeared. And a non-disclosure agreement with her signature on it dated 2 days before that. His hands had gone white on the wheel. My grandfather didn't lose my mother, Adiz. He priced her. The silence that followed felt enormous. Adiz thought of her own mother 4,000 miles away, fighting for every extra month the treatment could buy her, and something in her chest ached fiercely for the boy Tae-shik must have been 17, grieving a woman who hadn't actually left him, grieving a lie instead of a person. Why are you telling me this? She asked quietly. You barely know me. Because you're the only person in 6 years who's looked at me and seen a tired man instead of an empire, he said. And because Song-min thinks my grandfather already knows about you. Which means whatever he did to my mother to make her disappear, he's capable of doing to anyone he decides is a problem. The words landed like a stone dropped into still water, rings spreading outward. Adiz felt the shape of the danger before she fully understood it. Not gossip, not embarrassment, but something with the weight of 40 million won and a signature obtained under conditions she didn't want to imagine. Am I a problem? She asked. He looked at her, and for the first time since the sedan had pulled up beside her, there was no performance in his face at all, just a raw, unguarded fear that frightened her more than anything he'd said so far. You're the first thing in my life I've ever wanted to protect more than I wanted to inherit, he said. Which, where my grandfather is concerned, makes you the most dangerous kind of problem there is. Her phone buzzed in her coat pocket before she could respond. An international number. Her cousin calling from Enugu at an hour that made her stomach drop, because family didn't call at 3 a.m. their time unless something was wrong. She answered with shaking hands. Listen. Felt the blood leave her face. Adiz. Tae-shik's voice, urgent, watching her unravel in the passenger seat. What is it? What happened? She lowered the phone slowly, staring at nothing. The deposit and the 11 days and every careful calculation she'd built her survival on suddenly collapsing into irrelevance. My mother collapsed an hour ago, she whispered. She's in surgery. They don't know if she's going to make it through the night. And somewhere behind them, unnoticed in the dark, a second car had been following the sedan since it left the curb. Not Songmin's, and not friendly. Tae-shik didn't ask a single question. He simply turned the wheel hard at the next intersection, cutting toward the airport instead of her apartment, and picked up his phone with the terse, practiced authority of a man used to being obeyed instantly. "Get me the next flight to Lagos with a connection to Enugu," he said into it. "Private, if commercial can't leave within the hour. And call Dr. Eduora Nwosu. She trained at Severance. She's back in Nigeria now. I want her in that operating room as a consult before we land." "I don't care what it costs. Do it." Adiz stared at him, tears she hadn't let fall yet burning hot in her eyes. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." He glanced at her, and there was nothing performative left in his face at all. "I want to. There's a difference, and you deserve to know it." She cried, then, not the careful, contained tears she'd learned to shed in bathroom stalls and empty stairwells over 6 years of surviving alone in a foreign country, but the kind that came from somewhere old and exhausted, somewhere she'd sealed off the day she boarded a plane at 20 and promised herself she wouldn't break down where anyone could see. Tae-shik didn't try to fix it. He didn't fill the silence with reassurances he couldn't guarantee. He just reached over, found her hand in the dark of the back seat, and held it like it was the only thing keeping either of them steady. "I've spent 6 years being strong for everyone," she said, voice raw. "My mother, my roommates, my little brother who still thinks I'm doing fine here, that I'm not counting coins at the end of every month. I don't know how to not be strong. I don't know how to just fall apart." "Then fall apart," he said quietly. "I'll hold the rest." It was such a small sentence. It undid her completely. Somewhere over the next 2 hours, through the frantic airport transfer, through Tae-shik pulling strings she didn't fully understand to get her on a flight within 90 minutes, through him standing at the gate long after boarding had been called, refusing to let go of her hand until the very last second, Adiz understood that whatever this had started as, whatever careful walls she'd built around 6 weeks of stolen rides through the rain, had become something she no longer had the power to protect herself from. "Call me the second you land," he said. "I don't care what time it is there. You'll be asleep. I won't." He touched her face, gentle, like she was something that might break if he wasn't careful, and then, like he couldn't stop himself, like 6 weeks of restraint had finally run out. He kissed her, softly, in the middle of a crowded departure gate, in front of a boarding agent and 40 strangers, and, though neither of them knew it yet, a photographer his grandfather had quietly assigned to follow him 3 days earlier. If this story is making you feel something right now, the fear, the tenderness, the ache of watching two people find each other at the worst possible moment, take a second and like this video. And tell us in the comments what you would do in Adiz's position, because what's coming next is going to test both of them in ways neither one can undo. She landed in Lagos 14 hours later to find her mother out of surgery and stable barely, but alive. The tumor removed by a specialist who'd been flown in on absurdly short notice by a name the hospital administrator kept repeating like a prayer. Adiz sat by her mother's bed until dawn, holding her hand, whispering thanks in a language that had no adequate word for what Tae-shik had done. She didn't know yet what it had cost him. 3,000 miles away, Han Tae-shik stood in his grandfather's office at 6 in the morning, summoned before sunrise by a single line in a text message. "We need to talk about the girl." His grandfather, Han Byung-chul, 81 years old, silver-haired, a man who had built an empire from a single shipping container and never once apologized for what it cost him, sat behind a desk older than the company itself, a photograph laid flat in front of him. The airport photograph. A kiss. "Explain this," Byung-chul said, not looking up. "There's nothing to explain. I care about her. You've known her 6 weeks. His grandfather finally raised his eyes, and they were cold in a way that made even Tae-shik, 30 years old and heir to 17 subsidiaries, feel briefly 17 again himself. "Your mother knew your father 4 months before I ended it. Do you know how quickly these things can be made to disappear, Tae-shik?" The room went very still. "I know exactly how quickly," Tae-shik said, his voice low. "I've seen the file." Something flickered across his grandfather's face, not guilt, Tae-shik would think later, but something closer to irritation, the expression of a man discovering an inconvenience rather than a crime. Then you understand why I'm telling you this now, before it becomes necessary again. End it. Quietly. Generously, if you insist, I'll see she's compensated for her trouble. But end it before the shareholders vote in 8 months, or I will end it for you. And I promise you, grandson, my methods will be considerably less generous than yours. Tae-shik said nothing for a long moment. Then he picked up the photograph from the desk, the two of them at the gate. Her hand still gripping his jacket, neither of them looking at the camera because neither of them had known it was there, and slid it into his own pocket. I'm not 17 anymore, he said. And she's not disappearing. He walked out before his grandfather could answer. He didn't yet know that Byung-chul had already made a call, not to lawyers this time, not to a bank transfer and an NDA, but to a much older, much darker debt owed to him by a man in Lagos whose company handled customs clearance for half the pharmaceuticals entering southeastern Nigeria. A debt that was about to come due 3,000 miles away, in the hospital room where Adi's mother lay recovering, and in the immigration file that determined whether Adi's would ever be allowed back into South Korea at all. Adi's didn't find out about the visa the way most people find out their life has been rearranged without their consent, through a letter, a phone call, a moment of clean and terrible clarity. She found out in pieces, the way collapse usually comes. First, a text from her employer in Seoul asking why her work authorization had suddenly flagged for review. Then, 3 hours later, an email from the Korean consulate in Lagos stating that her re-entry visa had been placed under indefinite administrative hold, pending an irregularity in her sponsorship documentation that no one could explain to her in plain language. She sat in the hospital hallway with her phone in her lap and her mother sleeping fitfully behind a curtain 20 feet away. And for the first time since she'd landed, she let herself feel the full shape of what was happening. Not just her mother's illness. Not just the money. Something bigger, something with fingerprints on it that felt less like bureaucracy and more like a message. She called Tae-shik at 4 a.m. Lagos time. He picked up before the second ring. They're blocking me from going back, she said, voice tight. My visa. My whole sponsorship file. Someone flagged it. And it happened 3 hours after your grandfather told you to end this. Silence on the line. Long enough that she knew, even before he spoke, that she was right. I'll fix it, he said. That's not an answer, Tae-shik. That's a promise you can't guarantee, from a man whose grandfather apparently makes people disappear on a schedule. He doesn't make people disappear. His voice cracked slightly on the word, the first time she'd heard him sound less than composed. He makes them cheaper to deal with than the alternative. That's different. It's not better, but it's different, and it means there's always a price, which means there's always a way to outbid him. I don't want to be outbid for, she said. I want to be able to see my mother recover and go back to the life I was building before any of this happened. I know. Breath ragged. I know, and I'm sorry. And I need you to trust me for exactly one more day while I fix something I should have fixed 9 years ago. She didn't understand what he meant by that until the next afternoon, when a woman she'd never met walked into the hospital waiting room and sat down across from her without introduction. My name is Song Mirei, the woman said in careful, accented English. I worked for the Han family for 11 years. I was Tae-shik's mother's assistant, before she disappeared. Dee's pulse spiked. You knew her. I loved her like a sister. Mirei's composure cracked for just a moment, grief surfacing old and unhealed. Everyone was told she left. That she chose freedom over her son, over the family, over everything. I was in the room the week she disappeared. I saw the paperwork before they made it vanish. She didn't leave Miss Chukwu. She was given an impossible choice, and she made the only one a mother could survive making. What choice? Mirei's hands trembled around the folder she was holding. Leave and never contact her son again, and he grows up safe, provided for, protected by the family name, or fight, and lose custody entirely, publicly, in a way that would follow him his whole life. She chose the version where he at least got to keep the money and the name, even if it meant losing her. A tear slipped free, quick and furious, wiped away almost before it fell. She's alive, Miss Chukwu. She's been alive this entire time in Busan under a different name, watching her son from a distance she was never allowed to close. The floor seemed to tilt beneath Adi's chair. Why are you telling me this? Because Tae-shik doesn't know yet. I was afraid to tell him, afraid of what Byung-chul would do to her if the truth surfaced while she was still vulnerable. But he's about to inherit everything, and once he does, once the transition is final, Byung-chul loses the leverage he's used to keep all of us silent for 9 years. Mireille met her eyes, urgent. You are the reason he finally started asking questions. You are the reason he found the file at all. Whatever happens to your visa, to your visit, to this fragile thing you two have built in 6 weeks, it has already put a crack in something that has held for 9 years. Byung-chul knows that. It's why he's moving so fast to end it. If you've made it this far into the story, you already know this isn't just a romance, it's a family finally being forced to reckon with everything it buried. And Adiz is standing right at the center of the fault line. Drop a comment telling us what you think Tae-shik's mother has been waiting 9 years to say to her son. And hit subscribe if stories with buried secrets and long overdue reckonings keep you hooked. Because the next reveal changes everything you think you understand about who's really been protecting who. Adiz didn't sleep that night. She sat beside her mother's bed running the math of an impossible situation, a visa she couldn't fix, a man on the other side of the world fighting a war she'd accidentally started, and a woman in Busan who'd spent 9 years grieving a son who didn't even know she was alive to grieve for. At 6 a.m. her phone rang. I found her, he said, and his voice was doing something she'd never heard it do before, breaking open completely, all the careful composure gone. Adiz, I found my mother. She's alive. She's been alive this whole time. And I need you to understand something before I say anything else. What? Everything my grandfather has built, the company, the inheritance, the vote in 8 months, none of it means anything if I can't fix what he did to her. And I can't fix that without going to war with the only family I have left. Pause, raw and unguarded. I need to know you're still going to be standing beside me when I do. Outside the hospital window, dawn was breaking over Lagos, and 3,000 miles away, in a boardroom in Seoul, Han Byung-chul was already making the first calls of a campaign designed to ensure his grandson never got the chance to ask that question at all. Yes, Adiz said without hesitation, surprising herself with how easily the word came. I'm still standing beside you. But Tae-shik, if you go to war with him, you need to go in with your eyes open. A man who paid to erase your mother won't hesitate to come after me next. And I need you to promise me that whatever happens, my mother stays out of it. She's already fighting one battle. She doesn't need to be a casualty in yours. I'll protect her, he said. I'll protect both of you, even if it costs me everything he's ever offered me. He meant it. She could hear it in the way his voice had stopped performing entirely, stripped down to something raw and unpolished, a man choosing, in real time, which version of his life he was willing to keep. He flew to Busan that same afternoon. The address Mireille gave him led to a small Hanok guest house tucked into the hills above Haeundae, the kind of quiet, unremarkable place a woman might choose if she wanted to disappear from a life that had once required her to be visible in every room she entered. He stood outside the gate for 11 minutes before he could make himself walk through it. Mireille would tell Adiz later that she'd never seen him hesitate at anything in his life. Not once. Not even the day his grandfather told him he'd be chairman whether he wanted the job or not. The woman who opened the door was smaller than he remembered. Her hair silver now instead of black. Her face lined in ways that told a story he hadn't been allowed to read for 9 years. She looked at him the way a person looks at a ghost they'd prayed for and never expected to actually see. Tae-shik, she whispered, and the childhood name broke something open in him that he'd kept sealed since he was 17. They told me you left, he said, voice cracking. They told me you chose this. I spent 9 years hating you for something you never actually did. I know. Tears fell freely down her face now, unashamed. I wanted to find you so many times. I wrote letters I never sent because I was afraid the moment I reached for you, he'd take the one thing I still had, the knowledge that you were safe, that you were provided for, that some version of your life was still good even if I couldn't be in it. I told myself that not reaching for you was the last act of love I had left to give. He crossed the threshold and, for the first time in 9 years, let his mother hold him. They stayed for 3 hours. She told him everything, the shell accounts, the NDA she'd signed with a shaking hand while her 17-year-old son slept 2 floors above, not knowing his mother was being priced out of his life in real time. She told him about the 11 years she'd spent building a small, quiet life in Busan, running a tea shop under a name that wasn't hers, watching from a careful distance every milestone the tabloids photographed: his university graduation, his father's funeral, the day the board named him chairman-designate, never once close enough to be seen. "He'll come for you now," she told him, gripping his hands. "Once he knows you know. He'll come harder than he ever has, because the story you could tell a mother erased, a son lied to for 9 years, that's not just a family scandal to him. That's a threat to the succession vote. Shareholders don't invest in companies run by men whose grandfathers disappear inconvenient women." "Let him come," Tae-shik said. "I'm done being afraid of what he might do. I've spent 30 years being careful, being obedient, being exactly who he built me to be. I'm not doing it anymore." His phone buzzed as he said it. A message from Songmin. 3 words that emptied the color from his face. "Call me." He stepped outside to make the call, his mother watching from the doorway with a particular fear of someone who had already lost a child once to this family's machinery and couldn't survive losing him again. "They've moved on the girl," Songmin said without preamble. "Immigration flagged her exit visa an hour ago, not just re-entry, exit. She's being detained at Murtala Muhammad Airport in Lagos on a fraud allegation tied to her original work visa. It's fabricated, obviously, but it's enough to hold her for 72 hours while they build a deportation case that would bar her from Korea permanently." "When did this happen?" 40 minutes ago. Your grandfather made 3 calls this morning. 1 to the Ministry of Justice. 1 to a contact in Nigerian customs. 1 I haven't traced yet." Tae-shik felt something in his chest go cold and very, very still, the particular calm that settles over a person right before they stop weighing consequences. "Get the jet ready," he said. "And get me every document proving what he did to my mother. Every shell account, every NDA, every wire transfer. I'm done protecting a legacy that was built on erasing people who loved this family too much to fight back. If your heart is racing right now, if you're feeling the fear, the fury, the desperate need to know whether Adiz makes it out of that airport, this is exactly the moment to hit like and drop a comment telling us if you saw this coming, because what Tae-shik does next is about to force an 81-year-old empire to answer for 9 years of silence, and neither he nor his grandfather will walk away from it the same man. 6,000 miles away, in a windowless holding room at Murtala Muhammad International Airport, Adiz sat across a metal table from 2 immigration officers who kept repeating the word fraud, like it was a fact instead of an accusation manufactured overnight, and she understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful in its terror, that the 6 weeks that began with a near collision in the rain had somehow become the most dangerous chapter of her entire life. And somewhere above the Pacific, a private jet carrying the heir to one of Korea's largest fortunes was racing against a clock his own grandfather had started toward a woman he'd known for 6 weeks, and a truth he was finally ready to burn everything down to protect. The interrogation room smelled like stale coffee and fluorescent light, and Adiz had been answering the same 3 questions for 2 hours when the door opened, and a man in an expensive suit walked in without knocking, flanked by 2 officials who suddenly looked considerably less certain of themselves than they had 10 minutes earlier. "Miss Chukwu's visa flag has been reviewed and rescinded," the man said, sliding a folder across the table. "As has the fraud allegation, which, as your own records will show, if anyone bothers to actually read them, originated from a diplomatic request filed under false pretenses 4 hours ago. I'd be very careful about whose name ends up on the paperwork explaining that." Adiz recognized him a beat later. Songmin, the man Tae-shik had mentioned but she'd never met, standing in an airport interrogation room with the calm, immovable authority of someone who had spent a career cleaning up messes far bigger than this one. "Where's Tae-shik?" she asked, voice hoarse from hours of repeating herself to people who weren't listening. "Landing in 40 minutes. He asked me to make sure you were safe before he got here." Songmin's expression softened, just slightly. "He also asked me to tell you, and I'm quoting directly, which is not something I generally enjoy doing, that he's sorry it took him this long, and that it's the last time anyone in his family will ever be allowed to make you disappear." She was released 20 minutes later. She was standing at the edge of the arrivals hall, still shaking, when she saw him running through the crowd, no security detail keeping pace, no careful composure, just a man who had crossed an ocean faster than his own private jet schedule technically allowed, and who reached her and pulled her into his arms like he was making sure, with his whole body, that she was actually real. "I'm sorry," he said into her hair. "I'm so sorry. I should have ended this the moment I understood what he was capable of, instead of letting you become collateral in a war that's been mine my whole life." "You didn't let anything happen to me," she said, pulling back to look at him. "You came. That's the part that matters. It's not enough to just come," he said. "I need to end it. Permanently. And I need you there when I do, because he needs to understand that the people he's tried to erase aren't going anywhere this time." The shareholders' meeting that mattered, the one meant to happen quietly in 8 months, behind closed doors, with Tae-shik's succession a formality nobody questioned, happened instead 3 weeks later, moved up at Tae-shik's own insistence, and it was not quiet at all. He stood in front of Hanwuri Group's board, his grandfather seated in the front row with a face carved from stone, and laid out, document by document, exactly what had happened 9 years ago: the shell accounts, the NDA obtained from a grieving, frightened woman with a 17-year-old son as leverage, the 11 years his mother had spent erased from a life she'd never chosen to leave. He laid out, too, what had happened in the last 72 hours: a fabricated fraud case, a diplomatic favor called in to detain an innocent woman, an abuse of the very institutional power the shareholders were being asked to hand him. "You can choose to install a chairman willing to disappear inconvenient people to protect the family name," he said, looking directly at his grandfather for the first time in the entire presentation. "Or you can choose a chairman who believes the company's value was never worth what it cost the people who built it in silence. I know which one I intend to be. The vote is yours." The vote, when it came, was not close. Han Byung-chul did not attend the ceremony 3 months later when his grandson was formally named chairman, nor the smaller, quieter gathering 2 weeks after that, in a garden behind the Hanok guest house in Busan, where Han Tae-shik married a woman named Adiz Chukwu in a ceremony that blended a Nigerian Osewoke and a Korean Hanbok into something neither tradition had ever quite seen before, with his mother standing beside him for the first public moment in 9 years. And Adiz's mother, cancer in remission, flown in on a jet that no longer felt like an unearned luxury but like a small mercy in a much larger story, watching from the front row with tears she made no effort to hide. Adiz still remembers, sometimes, standing in the rain outside a hospital with a soaked piece of paper in her hand, certain that her life had reached the end of what it could bear. She remembers thinking, in that exact moment, that nothing good could possibly come from a taxi that nearly ran her over. She was wrong. Sometimes the worst nights of our lives are simply the ones disguising themselves, badly, as the beginning of everything we didn't know we were still allowed to hope for. Before you go, we'd love to hear from you. Subscribe if this story moved you. Share it with someone who believes in love that survives impossible odds. And tell us in the comments the biggest lesson you're taking away tonight, because stories like Adiz and Tae-shik's remind us that the people who see us most clearly rarely arrive the way we expect them to. That's how it started, and how, against every quiet calculation an 81-year-old empire had made to prevent it, it was allowed finally to become a life.